I have been eating well. I think I've not changed my diet at all.
That's a lot.
The only thing I've changed was no sugar and no pop. Barely pop. Stacking on the carbs. You're dropping
I drink many pop.
I do drink pop every once in a while.
I haven't had pop.
Yeah, I don't drink it like I used to. I drink like I drink water.
Okay, people.
That's why you're
All right, let's close up our laptops, face this way. We do have notes to take for just a little bit, and then I will explain your assignments. There's 2 of them, but they are relatively short, our same type of assignments, read, answer questions, and they are due tomorrow at 11:59. So we are still in this Gilded Age time period. This time we're going to look at, this chapter has us look at certain issues. So in this chapter, we're looking at the issues of segregation. We're looking at the issues of, what's the second section? Some politics. And then the last one will be farming. We'll begin to look at what issues farmers are facing as farming becomes more of a business and less of an institution of just family farming. So we're going to start with segregation and these social tensions. Our objectives on this one is to analyze how whites created a segregated society in the South and how African Americans responded, analyze efforts to limit immigration and the effects, compare the situations of Mexican Americans and of women to those other groups. So that will be what we will be looking at. One of the important things, and again, you'll see this in one of the readings, is understanding how this segregated society was controlled, and by using these laws called Jim Crow laws. And I hope when you read in the reading, it will say that all of this stuff happened until 1965. Mrs. Norris was born in 1964. Just to give you the idea that it might seem like a long time ago, it wasn't a long time ago when these things ended. So Jim Crow laws are laws that kept Black and white people segregated. One of the important things to know about this is that it was legal. And I think, again, thankfully, most of you guys in this age think that that was just something certain groups of people decided to do. It was legal. There was not any way for an African American to contest that I can't walk in the front door of a store. I have to go to the back door of a store. That was the law. The next one is a poll tax, a tax in which voters were required to pay to vote. This is one of the reasons that Mrs. Norris is so emphatic, enthusiastic about you understanding your right to vote. And unless, sorry, white gentlemen, unless you are a white gentleman, every person's ancestors in this room had to fight hard to vote. And I am not disrespecting you white gentlemen. I'm just saying that was the way it was. Everybody else that was not a white gentleman had to work hard to get the right to vote. And if you are a white gentleman, please always exercise your right to vote. But for those of us that are not, and the fact that our ancestors worked so hard, you are disrespecting them when you don't vote. A literacy test, a test given at the polls to see if a voter could read, used to disenfranchise. Disenfranchise means to keep someone from voting. And I'm just going to throw this out again lots of times. My mom's side of the family from North Carolina lived there hundreds of years. We are what most of you would call poor white cracker trash. And I could say that because that's what my family is in North Carolina, poor white cracker trash. My grandparents were sharecroppers. My papa went to the third grade. My papa cannot read. My papa couldn't read anything in his life. My papa couldn't write anything in his life. When my my grandparents were really strange in that hey, girls in the back, shh, they even as old people kept separate bank accounts. I don't know why they did, but they just did. So they all paid for their own stuff. So every Saturday, my papa went to buy groceries at the Piggly Wiggly. He could not write a check. Couldn't write a check. So when he got up to pay for his, he handed the cash register person the check. They wrote it out and he signed his name. Now, my papa voted every time. My papa was white. He did not get a literacy test. My papa would not have been able to pass a literacy test. My papa only got his driver's license because they were able to read the test to him. Couldn't read. And then the last one is the grandfather clause, a clause which allowed a person to vote only if his ancestors had voted prior to 1866. So is a black person ever going to be able to vote? No. And these are all legal. These poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause, all legal. Almost every southern state had this as part of their right to vote. So if you didn't have money, you couldn't vote. If you couldn't read, you couldn't vote. If your grandfather didn't vote, you could not vote. Booker T. Washington, most famous black leader during the late 19th centuries, encouraged African Americans to build up their economic resources. Here's a very interesting thing about Booker T. Washington. Lots of schools call Booker T. Washingtons. And as we move through our discussion about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, it will be important for you to see when people write history, and especially when people write history from a certain slant, who they think is the better person. Because history books are always going to promote Booker T. Washington. Always. And he is a great individual. But African American people aren't too crazy about Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington says hey, we should just be happy for anything white people let us have. Like, they're going to let us do these things. They're going to let us build our own schools and let us go. We should just be happy. People that write history, white people that wrote history, like, oh, we like this Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois, who they don't like, is the one that said, nope, not at all. The Constitution says all men. The Constitution says we have a right to vote. The Constitution says we can't be discriminated against. None of this. We'll take whatever you can give us. And so history tends to look really nicely on Booker T. Washington and not so great on W.E.B. Du Bois. They throw out that he's a socialist. But if you see, demand full equality now. That's what this says. And so, again, when we look at these people, that will be some of the things to look at. And then lastly, Ida B. Wells. I think we've had her a couple times, an African-American teacher who bought a newspaper and embarked on a lifelong crusade against the practice of lynching. And she will also be very fundamental in the women's suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement, again, at its core is very segregated. White women working for that. And Ida B. Wells wants to be part of that. And again, we have this tension between these two groups as well. So all this is happening because in 1876, we had a gigantic contested election. And as a result of that contested election, the southern states said, okay, you guys want this Hayes guy. We want this Tilden guy. Neither one of them got the electoral votes that they needed to win. So it went to Congress to decide. The southern states said, you know what? We really don't care who's president. What we want is for you to get these troops out of the South that are protecting black people. That's what we want. You tell us who you want for president. You tell us that you're going to take these troops out, and we will vote for whoever you want. And as a result, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. Historians like to call him Rutherford Fraud B. Hayes because he did not and should not have ever been president. But the South says, we'll do whatever you want, so you get these troops out. And so once federal troops leave that were protecting the rights of those freed black slaves, segregation becomes the norm. Segregation via Jim Crow laws becomes the norm, and blacks lose their voting rights despite the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says all men are allowed to vote, regardless, well, it says all people are allowed to vote regardless of color, creed, or nationality. It doesn't say gender, which is why we have to fight again, ladies, for that right. 15th Amendment, states cannot deny anyone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that's what W.E.B. Du Bois says. Hey, you can't give us this half stuff, Booker T. Washington. We want it all. Jim Crow laws segregate. And again, that segregation becomes the norm in these southern states. So ways in which blacks' right to vote were restricted in the South. Again, this is what we looked at the beginning. Poll taxes, required to pay to vote. That is illegal now, and it doesn't, guess when it becomes illegal? 1965. Mrs. Norris is 1 year old. Literacy test. And in the reading that you are going to have for today and tomorrow, you get a little synopsis of the literacy test. It is not, hey, read this paragraph. It is, write the word vote upside down and in order. I couldn't do that. Maybe I could if I tried really hard enough. But it's not a straightforward. Or it would be reading something like Shakespeare or reading some old English like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, something that you read in Mrs. Murdoch's class. Remember reading all those Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar, where you understand it if somebody explains it to you, but if you just read the words. Grandfather clauses again. And then the last one will be violence and the threat of violence. Terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan work because of terror. They don't really have to do a lot. They don't really have to kill a lot of people. They just have to scare enough people. And that will be what the KKK will use to intimidate African Americans to stay away. The burning of a cross doesn't really have any special recognition other than a mark. It's like the black mark, Voldemort's black skull and sky. It's a mark. It's terrifying. And the KKK uses violence as a way to intimidate African American people. KKK, sadly to say, is still in existence in most every southern state. In my, again, town, Goldsboro, our newspaper is called the Goldsboro News Argus. If you know what you're looking for, you can find every Klan meeting. They call it all different kinds of things. Clan of the Cooties, all kinds of weird things. Keyword is that they always meet in some kind of junkyard or salvage place. I don't know why that's the key. But again, this is directed toward free black slaves. And this, again, is what happens to voter turnout. Hello? Yeah. In about maybe 10 minutes? Okay. Bye-bye. Bailey, when we get done with notes, Mr. Listman wants to speak. So 1876, that is when federal troops are still in the South protecting African American voters. And we can see that turnout. It is almost 100%. So in the election of 1876, almost 100% of African Americans that can vote voted. And probably looks like maybe about 70 or 75% of white men voted. Hopefully you see how high that is. Our average voting turnout is less than 50%. It's sad. That's why I hope, again, and I will tell you as we get that if you don't remember anything in this class, forever and a day, you see and hear my voice every 4 years saying, vote, 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 vote. Whomever you choose, whatever political party believes, I do not care. That's not the point. You vote. and you can watch what happens. The reason, again, you can watch the white voting population decline because they don't need to, right? The African American vote declines by 1876 to about 10%. And I would really like to know who those 10% are, because they must have been very, and I don't mean powerful like strong, but very powerful minded people to be able to overcome all of those things. All right, our last slide of the day is the ending of this continuing. In addition to losing their voting rights, Blacks also faced widespread segregation in the North and the South. The constitutionality of Jim Crow laws was upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1896 case Plessy versus Ferguson. That's one of your readings. You're going to read about the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And what that is about is an African American, and I'm not sure what percentage. That's the other part. The South, when you registered, they categorized how African American you were by your ancestors. So you were a quarter, a half African American. Still, African Americans refused to accept their status as second-class citizens, and several important leaders emerged and called for equality. And again, that would be W.E.B. Du Bois. So you have two readings. Again, they're due tomorrow. One is about Plessy versus Ferguson. The other one is about Jim Crow laws. And as you're putting all these things away, just again to remind you, my mom, who grew up and lived her whole life in Goldsboro, North Carolina, went to a segregated high school. My mom graduated, well, she didn't really graduate because she got pregnant, but my mom would have graduated from a segregated high school in 1964. In 1964, the segregated school, the high school that was there, still part of the school corporation. They just use it as a storage place, but it's still standing. And my class that graduated in 1982 was the first class to go K through 12 integrated. And I started kindergarten in 1969. You can go ahead and go in 1969. You probably don't need to take your backpack unless, because you're just seeing Mr. Listman about a schedule change. Yeah, I don't think so. Take the pass with you. All right, questions, anyone? Okay.